Hi, welcome. Thanks for being here. I apologize for the late start. We're just working on a couple of our speakers and our panelists, so we were checking on them. And so I apologize for the late start, but I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education in the Office for Equity and Diversity. And welcome to A Failing Grade, Addressing Opportunity and Achievement Gaps in Public Education, our fourth conversation in this year's Critical Conversations About Diversity and Justice series. The Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries. The libraries have developed a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. We're now starting the fourth year of offering these conversations, and we're excited to continue offering live streaming so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they'll be archived on that website. And we've added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series. If you signed in, we will email a link to an online evaluation, or you can always access that link directly through the website. As with all of our conversations, we'll start with some discussion among our panelists and moderator, and then move out for Q&A. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Michael Go. Michael serves as Associate Vice Provost in the Office for Equity and Diversity. Michael is also an Associate Professor in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development, what we call OLPD, here in the College of Education and Human Development, where his teaching, research, and service are focused on how cultural intelligence can best be applied in intercultural education, international education and development, teacher education, counseling, and other disciplines. There's much more I could share with you about Michael, but his accomplishments are matched only by his humility, so he wouldn't let me share any more. But trust me when I tell you that he is the ideal candidate to lead us in this very important discussion. Please welcome Michael Go.
Thank you for that introduction, Anne. Thank you for those of us joining us via live streaming, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank also the panelists for accepting the invitation to join in this conversation. I think how we advertise this is probably the best way to try and capture why we're in the room today. It's a term that we even want to complicate and maybe disrupt, that we call the achievement gap, a statistically significant difference between white students and students of color in terms of test scores, grade point averages, graduate rates, college attendance, and other metrics. But before we disrupt it, we do recognize that for whoever holds that terminology and believes in this statistic, the U.S. Department of Education unfortunately ranks Minnesota as having one of the widest gaps in the nation. So for that reason, we feel it is vital, if you are even paying attention. People have written books, people have written opinions, people have blogged, people have shouted, people have debated, people believe they have the answer to the question. And anyone who believes that they have the answer is wrong. It is complicated, and I think if we need to approach this conversation with an openness to trying to deliberate what are the complexities, simple or multifaceted. And for that reason, we are very pleased to have our panel with us to introduce us to this conversation. Before we do that, I wonder how many of you know George Washington Carver? Do you know that name? Very good. Do you know that George Washington Carver was born during the Civil War era, born into slavery, and yet through the years, and kidnapped into Arkansas, and yet through the years received an education and became one of the foremost scientists, botanists, inventors, if you will, in this country, with a passion, I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, to create crops that would be more nutritious for the people in the South, but also in particular for the world, and discovered at the Tuskegee Institute at that time, founded by Booker T. Washington, more than 100 different ways to use the peanut. And for that, today we are blessed. But I think more importantly, his life is testament to what education can do in transforming one's opportunity, if you will. And it's not surprising, therefore, that I begin with this quote from George Washington Carver: "Education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom." And George Washington Carver lived this quotation about education. So with that, I would like to introduce the panelists by asking them to tell us a little bit about the work that they do and how it intersects and engages with this opportunity and achievement gap.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Sales Adams, and I am the Assistant Superintendent of Middle Schools with St. Paul Public Schools. But before I say that, I'm actually an alum of the University of Minnesota, and I got my teaching certificate here and my master's in curriculum and instruction. And I will tell you, when I was going through my studies here, reading it in a book is different than actually applying it when you get into the job. So after I left the University of Minnesota, I became a teacher in the Minneapolis public school system. So having the firsthand opportunity to see the achievement gap right when I get into the new profession. I went on to have different instructional leadership roles, becoming a principal in an urban area in Atlanta, Georgia, getting that perspective, but coming back to St. Paul Public Schools and being an elementary principal and a middle school principal. So I have some practical experiences that I'd like to share with you, especially coming from my new role as an assistant superintendent. In my role, I think that my work intersects with the opportunity gap and the achievement gap on a daily basis. But what I want to kind of talk about is the things that we are doing to actually try to address that. I really want to change the predictable outcome of what is taking place with our students of color in our city, in our state. I don't like being on the top of any negative list, so I approach my work from a sense of urgency, and the principals that I supervise, we all have a similar mindset. So that's the perspective that I'd like to bring to you today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Demarath. I'm an associate professor here at the U in the College of Education. I do anthropology of education, so I study school culture, especially how schools develop and maintain improvement-oriented school culture. I teach a large class with Michael Go in our teacher licensure program called Culture, Schools, and Communities. It's part of our common content strand that all of our teachers take. And we're very lucky to have Vichet Chuan here also in the front row. He's also a part of our faculty that teaches in the common content. And so I also just want to say it's a real pleasure to be here at the front of the room with Superintendent Sales Adams. One of the things that I had the honor of doing in the last few years was being a part of a team that was doing research and evaluation in St. Paul Public Schools on their turnaround leadership program. And I spent quite a bit of time with Lisa in her last posting before she became a superintendent over on the east side of St. Paul. And it really was an honor to see such a committed and talented school leader in action doing the work. And the work is something that I think we're both looking forward to talking to today.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Peter. Even as we engage the panelists to try and bring to surface some of your insights and your wisdom, obviously this is a topic we feel there are many in the audience, including Dr. Chuan, that we really want to bring the voice to the table. So be prepared to engage us after we hear from the panelists with your questions, with your insights as well. I'd like us, as the next question, to perhaps trouble this concept of the achievement gap. So can you help us unpack what this term means, why some people contest it as being problematic, or maybe not? Maybe you like the term, so help us, please.
Okay, well, I'll take a first shot at this, and we're looking forward to hearing your perspectives here too, of course. So I think we're going to need to talk about different dimensions of achievement gaps, and so what we're talking about here are predictable achievement gaps based on race, based on income, right? And the fact that Minnesota has the largest achievement gaps in the country is very, very troubling to all of us. That's why we're here today. And one of the things we'll want to do is I think we want to have a very honest conversation about race. We want to talk about the role of race in teaching. I think that's an important thing to talk about. The role of the race of our teachers, our teacher candidates in teacher education. That's one of the things I think we want to get to. I think also, though, we want to talk about another part of this gap that isn't always talked about, which is that actually since the 1940s, race-based achievement gaps in our country have actually been narrowing somewhat, right? The gaps that have been widening, though, are income-based achievement gaps, all right? And so the key point here is that being a member of a minoritized group doesn't in and of itself lead to lower achievement, all right? But it's the relative disadvantage that members of certain minority groups are more likely to experience that can contribute to these gaps. And so internationally, we know that disadvantaged students achieve at lower levels in every industrialized country. All right, so that's one of the most important things for us, I think, to kind of acknowledge here. A couple other things. So we're going to be talking about career and career success and different pathways that young people can take so that they can flourish in adulthood. But one of the things that I also want to mention is what the trajectories look like of young people going into higher education, because those statistics are very, very troubling. All right. And so in the 1970, young people from high-income families, they were 5 times more likely than young people from low-income families to have earned a bachelor's degree by age 24. All right. But in 2013, and this is some of the Pell Institute's most recent data, in 2013, individuals from these highest income families, they were actually 8 times more likely to have than young people from low-income families to have obtained a bachelor's degree by age 24. All right, a huge difference. Another way to look at this, and the numbers are really troubling, is bachelor's degree attainment by income quartile. Right, so if you divide up U.S. income into quartiles, all right, the lowest income quartile, all right, only 21% of young people from that quartile get a bachelor's degree by age 24, 21%. Next quartile, 29%. Next quartile, 51%. Do you know what the statistic is for the highest quartile? It's 99%. That's stunning, all right? So for these young people, all right, in the highest income quartile, 99% of them go on to get a bachelor's degree by age 24, all right? Is it because of their innate intelligence? Is it because of their innate talent? No, all right? There are other forces at work here, powerful forces at work, right? There's certainly economic support. These families are generally able to spend 7 times more on education than families from the lowest quartile, all right? But it also has to do with their social surround, and this is something that we're going to be talking about today. These young people are surrounded by relationships, and not just any kind of relationship. They're surrounded by relationships with people that expect them to go to college, right? Of course you're going to college. The only question is which college, right? All right, so with this kind of net, and it is a net, it's kind of a sociocultural net, right? It's almost like these people can't not go to college, all right? So one of the things that we want to talk about here is the expectations for what is possible, right, for young people in less advantaged neighborhoods and communities. That's one of the things that we need to talk about, and how to change for them what they think is possible for their own futures.
I think one thing I want to kind of address, in a public school setting, we do have different schools and different communities, and our students do show up in different manners. But I think what Peter really hit on is having those high expectations. But if we have students that come to us that don't have the skill set, then I think one of the reasons, or one of the ways to address that, is having high expectations, but also having the preparedness to meet the needs of the students. So teachers, there's a buzzword that is out there. It's called differentiation. But being able to differentiate your instruction is critical, because you need to be able to use your data to find out where students are. It's important to have those relationships, because you don't want to bring in the biases of, well, they won't be able to do it. So you don't want to lower the bar. But once you start to get prepared to differentiate your instruction, I think it's also important to make sure that you have the social emotional piece, so that the classroom management. And what I've also always told my teachers is when you're planning that lesson, the content is key, but you can't plan the lesson without the behavior management piece as well. And sometimes behavior management can seem kind of negative, but really it's more of the having the skill set to be able to make sure that your students are actively engaged. Are you able to redirect your students? Are you able to connect your students with the content that meets their needs while you're working with a small group of students? Because it's okay to throw that whole group instruction out there, but do you know how to bring your students into a small group to go over those concepts, to make sure that they connect with it and that they're also able to apply it? And I think what I have seen in my role as principal and assistant superintendent is walking into a classroom, I can immediately assess if the teacher has those skills and if they don't. Because walking into a classroom where the teacher has those skills, I can walk and I can see that the students are seated, that they have the content in front of them, that maybe they're working in small groups and they're discussing what the topic is. Teachers are sitting there side by side working with students, but students are also working independently. We have the ability to accelerate our students, but also to give support. And what I have seen sometimes in our schools where we do have a pervasive achievement gap is I think the expectations are low. I think that the delivery of the instruction might be more in the form of worksheets, more of the form of word finds, coloring. We have to set the bar high, and then students are going to get there, but we have to help them and scaffold our instruction. But if we always set it down here, that's where the students are going to reach to that level. Our students are, all of students are innately intelligent, but if we don't come prepared to teach them, then we're putting them at a disadvantage. And then if you start to look at the trend in a certain community, that might be the practice of that community for 40 years. So how are we really getting all of our students prepared in those communities to have access to high rigor engagement, be ready for middle school, be ready for high school, college and career and beyond? So what Peter was describing about the students in that highest percentile, that's what happened in my household. There was never the conversation of I wasn't going to college. It was where I was going and I was going to finish. There was never even the conversation of not finishing. That was the expectation, and I met that expectation. And I actually came through St. Paul Public Schools, and my teachers did have high expectations. I do believe our teachers do have high expectations, but we need to have them for all. So just to kind of recap, knowing the content, and this is really for any of our, how many people are working on becoming teachers in the room? Anybody? So you have to have the content, but you also need to know how to develop relationships and have classroom management. That is critical.
Thank you. What I think the audience and I appreciate is how in the unpacking of that term, you've shifted this notion of the achievement gap from being an individual act, from being the responsibility of the student, which I think we're not denying, to a host of resources, people, from families to teachers to communities. So can you explain why the gap is persisting, if you will? I mean, the gap exists, but it seems to be persisting.
I'll be honest, I don't have the answer for why it's persisting. I agree with you. If I did have the answer, I think that I would be a very rich woman right away, because I certainly would get out there and market it around. But I think that we have the commitment to try to figure it out. I think that, I guess, and I don't want to come from a deficit place. I want to come from an asset place, because that's how I guide my work. But I think it's important to know the data behind it, but not only know the data, but actually get into action and doing it. In St. Paul Public Schools, we really believe in having courageous conversations about race and really looking at what our biases are, not in a negative way, but you may not even know that you're showing up with these biases. But once you recognize that, how does that affect my teaching? How does that affect how I engage with my students, my parents, my community? But then when I look at my lessons, how am I really looking at my lessons, and does my instruction really reflect the kids in my classroom? Because we're becoming more and more diverse in Minnesota, and our classrooms are more and more diverse, so we can't deliver our instruction in just one way. And that really makes a lot of more work for teachers, because the teacher's workload is immense. But to really connect with our students, to capture their attention, to give them the joy of learning, that's a responsibility that we have. But I think also, when teachers are in their classroom and they are doing the instruction, it's important to really assess along the way, how are my students learning? Are they actually capturing this concept? And if they're not, then I have the responsibility to go back and try it again. And I may not try the same thing the same way because I might get the same result. How can I do it differently? And how do I need to do it differently for all the different learners in my classroom? We also do something called co-teaching in St. Paul Public Schools, where we will have a special ed teacher working side by side with a regular ed teacher. It could be an ELL teacher, so we can really break those groups down, but also share our expertise, so we're really hitting high on those standards, those skills that our students need to have. It is a responsibility for all of us. It's community, it's parents, it's universities, it's politicians, it's instructional leaders. This is an issue that we all have to work towards, but also really working with the students and really helping them set goals. How are you doing? Are you also being responsible for your learning as well?
Yeah, and I appreciate how Superintendent Sales Adams is talking about teacher expectations, right? And so in thinking about trying to understand how these gaps persist, right? One place to focus would be on three different sets of expectations: teacher expectations, but also parent expectations and student expectations for their own futures, right? And so Lisa's talking about, for example, the key importance of culturally responsive teaching, right? Connecting to young people's knowledge, the expertise that they bring into a classroom, right? But she's also talking about the importance sometimes of disrupting teacher expectations and intervening, all right? And so one of the things that I've seen her do as a building principal is talk to teachers about their beliefs. One of the things that she said that she was very disturbed by in one of her last posting at times was teacher lack of beliefs in students, that students are bored in a lot of their classes, they're not being challenged, they're doing word finds, right? And that the intelligence and the growing intelligence of a lot of these students is not being tapped into, right? And so that's the kind of thing that school leaders need to do. It's also the kind of thing that teacher leaders need to do with their colleagues, right? And so part of that, the teacher expectation part, if I was going to start a new school, I think one of the things that I would start with, the cornerstone, would be shared beliefs in student capabilities. For me, that would be a cornerstone, right? And I've seen building principals like Superintendent Sales Adams, like others here in the Metro, they will guard and protect that at almost any cost, all right? Those shared beliefs in student capabilities, that's really important. But let's turn for a second to the role of parent expectations and student expectations. So I think one of the things that's important to understand also in some more disadvantaged neighborhoods is that, first of all, these parents, they want what's best for their children. They do, right? But there may be challenges that they face that keep them from being able to attain what is best for their children. And some of this has to do with their own experiences, okay? So we might be talking here about parents or parents whose parents have had difficult experiences with all kinds of public institutions, right? All right, we're talking about not only the criminal justice system, we're talking about U.S. government lending policies back in the 1940s and 50s. We're talking about redlining, all right, which has a lot to do with gaps in wealth creation across racial groups in our country, all right? Very, very important to keep these things in mind, right? And so for parents then, helping them to raise expectations is also part of the work. It's truly part of the work. Because as Lisa was saying earlier, one of the most troubling things that we see in these communities is parents having the expectation that most likely things aren't going to work out for their young people, right? Most likely they're not going to do too well in school. Most likely they're not going to graduate from high school and go on to college, all right? And I had a young person on the east side of St. Paul tell me a couple of years ago, and these are her words, she said, quote, I mean, we get caught in the cycle that we don't think that there's very many opportunities out there, right? So when she was in high school, she ended up thinking probably the best that she could do would be a community college. That was her 9th and 10th grade year, all right? She's now a sophomore at Brown University. So one of the things that we want to get into here is how that happened, right? How those expectations got reset. And a big part of this is helping young people imagine a more positive future for themselves. that's extremely important, a future where they graduate from high school and they can embark on a promising career path, or perhaps go to college to live a life where they can flourish. And so what I'm trying to say here then is that compared to students from these upper quartiles, right, in the United States of income, many of these young people experience what Michael and I would refer to, and I think Lisa would be on the same page here, as a relationship gap in terms of certain kinds of relationships, right, with people that have career and college expectations for them, and with knowledge of how they can get there.
Thank you. I appreciate, Lisa, you're trying to move us to a more optimistic asset base. But if I can stay with the deficit just a little bit, because I'm looking out at the room, and I'm not sure we all maybe hold the same views about race and what it means and how it matters. And that's come up several times in both of your narratives so far. So on the one hand, we hear you giving examples of teachers and being able to teach with relevance. Some of us know that it's culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive. But are we talking about race in other ways as well? Systemic racism, unconscious bias, racial microaggressions. What was the other one I want? Stereotyping. Would you dare speak to that a little bit?
Sure, I'll just kind of talk about my perspective in our district. Through our racial equity work, we do talk about those terms. We have some real courageous conversations that sometimes might make people feel a little uncomfortable, but we do talk about stereotype threat. We do talk about microaggressions. We do talk about, bringing ourselves to the table, because we have our background, we have our biases, everybody does. But I think it's important to recognize that. And I think it's important that we don't make ourselves feel bad, but it's important that we look at that and we look at the work that's ahead of us. We look at the children that are ahead of us. We look at the community that we work in, because really the school is a part of the community. A healthy school is a healthy community. So it's important to, I think, for us as a society to really embrace that, to know that we do have a problem. We can look in the news on a daily basis to see we do have a race issue right now. And we need to address that. We need to have those conversations. I think if we continue to not, I don't know how we are going to address this achievement gap, because I do agree with Peter that every parent wants their child to have a good education. They want their children to go to good schools. They want their children to become very successful and productive citizens. And I haven't met a child that doesn't want to learn. I think students show up different ways, and I think it's our responsibility to meet that child where they are. And I also think as an instructional leader in the building, it's important that we meet our staff where they are, we meet our parents where they are, and we have those conversations and we're understanding, but we're able to really talk about what's important. And what's important is the student. Every student, kindergarten through high school, that's who's important. That's why we do our work. So we have to have those conversations, because we are educating our future. And I think that if we don't jump over that difficult hurdle, where are we going to be? Because I look at my childhood growing up in the cities, going through public education. I got a great education, but I don't think the times were the same as they are now. We are in a different situation.
Thank you.
You want us to be really honest here, right?
Well, it's critical conversations,
Yeah.
difficult conversations.
Okay. So a couple things. One would be when we're talking about race and education, and especially the role of race in teaching. I think one of the things that Lisa and I would want to focus on here is the role of race in the establishment of effective teaching learning relationships between students and teachers, right? That's really important. That's what the Beyond Diversity training, the equity work in St. Paul, Courageous Conversations really is all about, And so a lot of this is really oriented towards helping teachers learn about the relative advantages and disadvantages that accrue to them because of the color of their skin, right? So one thing I would mention that I've noticed, and both in my own experience and in experience being in schools and things I've read, is that for white people, there can be a couple of different reactions to this. There can be a couple of different responses. One can be a response of guilt, right? It can be a response of guilt, acknowledging white privilege, right? And this can lead some white educators to shut down. It can lead others to acknowledge the guilt, but then say, okay, I'm good, all right? There's not much else I need to do, all right? But we've got a colleague here in the college, Tim Lensmeyer, that's written about this, and he says, you know what? That's not where anti-racist education ends. It doesn't end with acknowledging skin privilege or advantage. It has to go beyond that, right? It has to lead to awareness, okay? So, for example, I think actually one of the most, in some ways, one of the most kind of concise ways to think about race advantage, and so I'm talking about kind of my own experience as a white person, is that as a white person, one of my most important advantages is that when I walk into a room, any room, when I go through any door, I don't have to wonder if the color of my skin is going to make a difference on what happens on the other side of that door. I don't have to wonder about that. All right? And that's a hugely important part of race advantage. All right? And so what I'm talking about here is instead of either shutting down, instead of acknowledging guilt and not moving beyond that, what I hope to see among educators is that it can lead to a greater awareness of self relative to other people of all kinds, right? Especially your students, okay? And trying to also to have a greater understanding and empathy for people whose experiences you can never fully understand, all right? That's important. And so Michael also mentioned microaggressions, right? And these can be pernicious, all right? They can be pernicious. And so, by the way, students can experience fairly overt racism in schools, right? I've had students of color in high schools tell me about teachers that took away their tablets. There's this one-to-one digital initiative in St. Paul, and they know that other kids have done the same things and they didn't get their tablets taken away, all right? That can have a really strong effect on a student's belief in that school, on their academic engagement. Why am I being treated unfairly on the basis of my race, all right? Because that's the perception, all right? And that's very damaging. So that's part of what we're talking about here, right? But racism can also be much more subtle, and it can also operate at a more unconscious level, okay? And so part of this fairly new term, microaggressions, and that's something to also strive to be aware of. And Michael knows that this is something that I think I actually experienced. I actually was responsible for a microaggression, probably more than one, just one that I'm pretty sure of, which was last fall at an event here on campus. We were having a conversation about these great resources in the center this person works in, and I found myself saying, just kind of making conversation, so are you a student here at the U, right? Where I was talking with a staff member at this kind of fair, an equity and diversity fair, and this is a person from Southeast Asia who's somewhat small, and I could see this person's shoulders kind of slump, right? And I realized later on, when I was in this breakfast later on, I think I might have just been responsible for a microaggression. I think I might have made an assumption about this person, right? And don't know where that came from. So I decided to follow up and check, right? So I sent this person an email, asked if we could meet, kind of follow up about these resources. But also, we had the meeting, and I asked about that, and I also said, I think I might owe you an apology, right? And the long and the short of it is, the person said, actually, I don't remember that. But he said, thanks for checking. So, some of the work.
Thank you. So whether continuing this race framework, tell us a little bit about what you've done in schools or in teacher preparation or in your other teaching, Peter, to address this gap that we're here to talk about today.
So the teacher ed program that Michael and I teach in, that Vichet also teaches in, one of the things we're trying to work on is preparing teachers who can form effective teaching learning relationships with all students, right? That's one of the things that we're working on to address this relationship gap. And so what we're really trying to do there is build teacher awareness of self, especially awareness of self in relation to others. We want them to have a critical view of U.S. history and U.S. education history, kind of the competing norms and ideals that have shaped our nation and our education system as it is. But we're also trying to build towards what Lisa was mentioning, what's so important in culturally relevant pedagogy, which is educators having a degree of intercultural competence, right? And that's a challenge, but that's what we're talking about. And so we're turning to some different resources right now. We're trialing some work that originated in Singapore, where Michael's originally from, on cultural intelligence. And so we're actually trialing a cultural intelligence measure with our student teachers here at the U. And we're right in the middle of that. And so we're figuring out what that might mean for us. But we have very frank, open, honest conversations about race, gender equity as well, class in our course. And so that's one of the things that we're working on.
If I can follow up real quickly, Peter, and I mean this part tongue-in-cheek, but also utterly seriously, that I can just hear people saying, oh, that's such a liberal agenda. Is it?
Still looking at me. It's a public agenda. It's a public agenda. And I think that's the question. To what extent do the people of our state and nationally buy into a public agenda like that, right? To what extent do people believe that education should be the great equalizer, as Horace Mann said? To what extent do you believe in that, really? I was just at an international conference on school effectiveness and improvement a couple of weeks ago in Scotland. One of the things I noticed is that many other countries seem to be making more vigorous efforts to address inequities in their society through education, and they are investing a great deal of resources in these initiatives. One of the things that worries me is that I think in our country we may have a higher tolerance for inequality in the United States, and I think that runs pretty deep, and I think that's very troubling.
Yeah, so I would say for that, I think that I have seen in my experience where I've been in situations where people have shown up as if they expect more for their children versus other children. So I've had to have conversations about we are here to educate all children, to provide a rigorous, engaging, and safe learning environment for all children. And I think that's the fundamental premise of public education. It's for everybody. It's not for some, it's not for few, it's for all. But I think what our district is doing is we are really trying to look at how we can kind of level the playing field. So for instance, we have something called Reflecting St. Paul. So if we have a child who is from a more economically depressed neighborhood where their schools have a lower achievement gap, we actually have spots reserved at our schools that have higher results on the MCAs. They're a celebration school where we actually reserve spots for children, and we will provide transportation so their children can have access for that. We certainly have choice in St. Paul. We have choice in Minnesota. We are really looking at our programming to make sure that our students of color get access to our rigorous classes, our AP classes, our international baccalaureate classes. We're working with students if they're not ready to get in those classes. We're providing scaffolds, or we have a class before the class, because if they get there, we want to make sure that they're able to remain and be successful. We're looking at how our accelerated classes sometimes have weeded children of color out. So I have principals who don't even want the accelerated classes in their classroom. They want to make sure that the instruction is rigorous for all. And they've had to have really critical and courageous conversations with their school community about, you know, we want to provide this instruction for all, because when we all do better, we all do better. I think one thing that we really are working on is really having these courageous conversations. So I know I continue to talk about that, but really providing a safe place for our staff to have those conversations. So if I am sharing my ideas, my thinking, I'm not going to be judged about it. I'm able to speak my truth. But then as a faculty, we really accept multiple perspectives and we want to hear them because that's how we start to learn and grow from each other. You never know where someone's coming from. And we all start at a point, but we also can end at a different point. But also being able to accept and expect non-closure. So Peter and I might disagree on something, but that's okay that we have the dialogue because we're going to learn and grow together. And I might learn something from your perspective and you may learn something from my perspective, but also having the commitment to continue the conversation, continue the work, because the work that we're continuing is meeting the needs of all of our students. And I think with the achievement gap, it's not just about race. It could be special ed kids. It could be students that speak English as a second language. We need to look at all of this. It could be a gender bias or a gender gap. So we need to look at all of our students. But I think that in our society, we, again, and I'll say this again, we need to accept this responsibility that we need to have the conversation and not just have the conversation, but really actively do something about it. And I'm liking that I'm hearing that this is starting in the colleges because we want to make sure that we're sending our teachers prepared just to begin. Because I will tell you, when I began my first year of teaching, there wasn't a book that could have prepared me for that. But to have more skills and more experiences, maybe having more practicums in different areas so teachers can actually see that, I think that's important. But also, I guess I'll just stop there, but I think just having the conversation, having the commitment to move forward, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to go back for a minute to something that we were talking about earlier that Lisa was mentioning, which is the importance of helping teachers and students raise expectations for students, right? And so this is so crucial, and it's hard. All right. So one of the things I want to share with you is just a little bit about what I've been learning about this because I've been trying to focus on this. And so for here at universities, we often hear about scaling up initiatives, right? Something works in a certain place, so we're going to try to scale it up. Sometimes those things work, sometimes they don't work. All right. One of the things that I've been trying to do with some of my colleagues here, especially through Generation Next and UROC, is actually to scale down our research, okay, to descale it, to capture local innovation, to capture the local creative efforts of educators in schools, on the ground, in their classrooms, in hallways, all right, to try to understand what's really working and what the processes are that make it work, okay? And so one of the things I've been looking at is some of you have probably heard about the interest in non-cognitive factors, okay, that are also responsible for student success. Things like grit, perseverance, academic mindsets, confidence, right? So I've been looking at some of this in St. Paul, and I've learned a lot from educators on the east side of St. Paul, all right? And so a couple of the most important things, and what I'm trying to do here is kind of put together a grounded model of what assets or what capabilities, what non-cognitive factors students really need to acquire when, and how teachers and adults and leaders in buildings are helping them to acquire them, and also what's in the way of other students acquiring these things. So, one thing is in students believing in themselves, teachers always giving them another chance, right? And that's one of the hard things about teaching. Many of you have been teachers and you're currently teachers, right? Teaching is emotional labor. It is, all right? And if students are in your classroom and they are not doing what you hope them to do in class, it can be really hard to give them a fresh slate the next day, right? But that's what the best teachers do. They say every day is a new chance, right? And that's so important. The other thing that I see is teachers finding a variety of ways, and schools and districts finding a variety of ways for students to identify their sparks, right? A spark is an interest. It's something that lights a person up. And the key thing is here, it may not be linked to the formal curriculum, right? It might be something outside of school. That's okay, right? If it's something that lights a person up, it can have carryover value to their academic engagement because now we're talking about their future, right? And their ability to further develop that skill or that interest. So sparks are really important all across the curriculum, the extracurriculum outside of school, and teachers need to find ways to learn what those are in young people and ask them about them, right? That's part of that relationship building that we're talking about. But the last thing I'll talk about is helping students think about the future. So future orientation. So catch this. Future orientation, that's seen as a gateway asset in the literature on non-cognitive factors, right? In other words, once students develop future orientation or an ability to envision a positive future for themselves in career, college, etc., then many of these other assets will be easier for them to acquire. Things like work ethic, hard work, the ability, the belief that hard work pays off, things like that, learning from failure, things like that. But it's that future orientation part that just seems so critical. And one of the people that I've been looking at and spending time with in St. Paul recently is the director of a large college and career center in one of the high schools in St. Paul. And this person has a very strong belief in young people and their futures, right? So one of the things that he would say is that he wishes, though, that he could sometimes reprogram student thinking, because this is getting back to those lower expectations that a lot of students have for themselves. He'd say, quote, when a student has something go their way, they are just expecting it to be taken away, all right? And all this can get in the way of their outcomes, right? So one of the things I heard students say, because I interviewed a whole bunch of students and I asked them, so what adults in this building have helped you acquire some of these non-cognitives, right? And so many of his students mentioned this one person, and one said, quote, he sees something in myself that I sometimes forget, and that is my potential to succeed and overcome things, all right? And this is a person that helped that student I mentioned earlier kind of reset her own expectations from going to a community college to going to an Ivy League college, all right? And just so you know, I'm not going to do this here, but when this guy teaches, he stands on the chair in the front of the room. He's a big, tall white guy. He's already tall, but he's standing on the chair in front of the room, right, talking to these students. And he'll do things, and he'll take money out of his wallet, and he'll say, I'll give this money to any of you that can guess what question I'm about to ask you. All right? And the students are like, I don't know, maybe what we had for lunch, or I don't know. And nobody can get it. And then he'll say, the question is, why are you able to give money away? And the answer is, because I went to college, all right? So he's always searching, in his words, for bang for the buck. First assembly for the senior class a couple falls ago, he stood on stage in the auditorium in the school, and he had a bowl of school supplies, all right? Big bowl of school supplies. And he's talking to the seniors about what they need to do to get their college applications rolling, all right? And all the steps involved in those college applications, okay? What does he do? He takes the big bowl of school supplies and he throws it out into the auditorium, all right? Right in the middle of the senior class. Then he says, did anyone catch anything? Did anyone catch everything? No, right? And he says, that's what your year is going to be like if you don't start now on your college applications. There are too many things for you to tackle, for you to do, to not start now, all right? So what he's doing is he's working on young people's imaginations, all right? And that kind of imaginative work, right? Also that we were talking about earlier that Lisa has done with teachers, right? Resetting expectations for students, resetting beliefs about students. I mean, imagination, that's a resource that it doesn't cost anything, but it can be very, very powerful.
Thank you. So just to prepare the audience that we're going to transition into engaging you in a question and answer or discussion time. But I want to invite the panelists to maybe take a moment with not a final thought. We're still here engaging you, but with some thoughts about what hopes you have in this conversation. And maybe be honest about what barriers remain and be able to name that.
Well, I have a hope that we will be able to find the answer to how we do close the achievement gap. I have a hope that we can come together with all the entities that would have responsibility to do this work, that we actually get it done. I have a hope that we are able to provide a solid, good education for all children so they can pick what they want to do after high school if it's post-secondary, if they want to go to the military, if they want to go to college, if they want to be entrepreneurs, but that is a real possibility for any child. I have a hope that we are able to have strong schools in every community, so it really wouldn't matter where you live. Your child has access to many schools in their communities that are strong. I have a hope that from the political standpoint that we're able to fund our schools so we can do the critical needs that we can. I have a hope that we can really engage with the communities and our parents so we can give them a promise that we can actually deliver on, that we have this, your child will be great, and we want to partner with you, and we're going to make this happen. I have a hope that when we have young teachers coming into the profession, that that we're able to embrace them, that we're able to give them a really good, solid experience, because it does hurt my heart to see teachers leave the profession early. That's a concern of mine. So I want to make sure that we're able to partner and that we actually have conversations from the public school setting, the private school setting with the colleges and universities. So we can kind of close that gap. But I have a hope that we're able to really have an educated society within America where our students can do and be everything that they can, and we won't look and see these predictable outcomes that happen over and over again, and we don't have this generational poverty. I hope that we won't be able to do that. I think some of the barriers that might happen are things that are happening now, is that we're moving too slow. I think that we just, I guess, admiring the problem because we don't have the answer yet. So how do we really find out how we can resolve that? And I think another barrier is having that sense of urgency, but really moving at light speed to make sure that we resolve this issue.
Everything that Lisa said. And just to say something about funding here, especially. So, and you don't hear this said much, but I still think our classes are too big in the public schools. They're too big, And why are we settling for that? All right. You look at other schools. You look at independent schools. You look at parochial schools. They don't have 39 students in a math class. They don't. All right. And there's research on this too. And I think another barrier that we need, and this is part of another barrier, which is that I think our schools and our teacher education programs still are set up primarily for teachers to learn how to deliver content, right? And not to establish effective teaching learning relationships with students, right? That is a different priority that we need to emphasize. We really do. And that will get at these other factors that lie behind academic success that we're talking about. And just one other thing to add would be in teaching, and that's linked to this, is being really serious about dispositions in teaching, right? Dispositions. Again, it is about, like Lisa's saying, it's certainly about content knowledge. We need teachers who know their content, right? But we also know teachers who know themselves and are willing to be students of their students' lives, right? That is what underlies effective culturally relevant teaching, is being able to be a student of your students' lives, to learn what lights them up, to learn what funds of knowledge and expertise they bring to the classroom, so then you can link that to the content that you're trying to teach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wish that we had the advantage of two of our colleagues here, and I regret that they're not able to be with us. Mr. Amin is still in school. I probably suspect trying to resolve some crisis. And his boss, Michael Bradley, probably has a good reason he's not here either. But Roosevelt High School, if you kind of just Google that school, you will also learn their narrative and how the principal and the staff and the students have been instrumental in truly turning around that school from what was an undesirable, perhaps in my word, school to attend to a much sought after place to be, and how they were able to shift that narrative. But I say that also to acknowledge that it was really hard to try and compose this panel. There are so many people we wanted to invite, and Anne will remember, I want this person, I want that person, and she kept limiting me in the number. I think you'll also recognize the original title for this workshop was F is for failure. And I said, that's too damning, and that's too hopeless. And I think we heard a lot of challenges, a lot of barriers, but we also hear a lot of hope. And so I decided to suggest a change and suggest that we have that punctuation critical, a question mark, and then how we can improve that. But I invite the many voices that are in the room, not just to interact with the panel, but to interact with each other with your questions. So can I invite people to
And we'll just ask everyone to speak into the microphone so we can.
have it recorded? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for taking the time to do this, by the way. I had a question about why we in Minnesota have the biggest education gap in comparison to other states. Is it because our white students here are doing much better than they are in other states? Or, I mean, I know that that's kind of a difficult question, but.
Well, I haven't done the research on that. I haven't done the research on that, comparing our achievement gap in Minnesota as far as how the white students are succeeding compared to white students in other states. I think looking at the data, our white students are certainly outperforming our students of color, which defines the achievement gap. I don't know if that answers your question, because it sounds like you're asking for data in comparison to Minnesota and other states.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, what are we doing differently as a state that other states aren't doing or are doing? Like, why does Minnesota have the biggest education gap in comparison? I mean, I know that can kind of seem like I'm looking for data or statistics, but.
Well, I think Peter, and I'll pass this really quick, I think Peter kind of struck a vein, because he also talked about Minnesota has a huge income gap between blacks and whites in the country. And we also have one of the fastest growing rates of poverty in the suburbs in comparison to other states. So we have the achievement gap, we have an income gap, we have poverty growing at a fast rate in the suburbs. So those are a lot of negatives that I think could have an impact on public education.
Thank you. I think there was a question at the back. Oh, Peter, go ahead.
Just really quick, I think that sure, there are as you're saying, the relative achievement of white students, that's a part of it, but also we have a lot of racially isolated neighborhoods and communities in this state and in the metro area, and that's a big part of this. And I hope that people saw the Star Tribune poll that's just been released this week. It is very, very startling with regard to the different experiences that black and white people have in this state and their different perceptions, right? And so that's a part of this, okay? But racially isolated schools at the elementary level, at the middle school level, that's also a part of this.
Thank you.
I think at the back first, and then we'll come to the front.
I know. Thanks. My name is Amber Jones. I'm an alum of the U in the community organizer in education. And I have a couple of questions. The first one, and I'm kind of sad that we didn't talk about school culture. This is your research background, but I really do want to have a conversation about that. As far as where key elements of a positive school culture versus a negative school culture, and how are we in Minnesota and some of our schools perpetuating very harmful negative elements of school culture, and what we can do about it. And then another piece to the conversation is, Superintendent, you touched on a healthy school is a healthy community, and we want to see healthy schools in every community. So what's being done on the ground to make sure every school in every neighborhood is a healthy school, so that we don't have to bus kids out to other schools? Because I personally also believe that you should have a school in your community that is a quality school, and you don't have to send them anywhere else. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll give you an example about school culture. So Peter kind of referenced the work that we had did previously. So I was the principal at Battle Creek Middle School, which is on the east side of St. Paul. And when I began my principalship, it was at the time that St. Paul transitioned from junior highs to the middle school model. So we had a lot of transition and change in the first year. And I'll be the first to admit that it was very challenging. It was challenging. I had a lot of new teachers that were there. We had transitioned special ed students that were not normally mainstreamed into the middle schools at that time, as well as English language learners. So we just had a lot of change at the same time. And I think my first year there at the beginning, the school culture wasn't as positive as I wanted it to. It wasn't in line with the vision that I had for a positive learning environment. So we did a lot of work. And we did a lot of work at grounding what our beliefs were, what our principles were, and we stuck to those the entire year. And we really talked about connecting with students, building positive relationships, giving students an opportunity to try it again, because students need a new chance every day. And we have to show up as adults, and it might be difficult, but how do we support each other in getting that done? How do we have those conversations? We really looked at data. We looked at data because our data told a story. Our behavior data certainly told a story about school culture, and that data showed that possibly some kids had a more positive experience than others. And I will say that my African American students had more office referrals, they had more suspensions, they had more in-school suspensions. So we actually had a conversation on our leadership team about, I wanted to know what disrespect was, because that was one of the things that students really had a lot of referrals for. And I think that our leadership team was a little diverse. I really worked at trying to hire teachers, faculty, staff that reflect our student body. That was something that was really important to me. So we had a really interesting conversation about what disrespect was. We weren't on the same page. So we really wanted to hash that out, because what I had shared as an observation with my leadership team, because one of the things that teachers described as disrespect was talking. So talking when I'm teaching. And as a teacher, I believe that is disrespectful. You should listen and let the teacher deliver the content. But the perspective that I shared, because my team and I did a lot of walkthroughs and provided feedback, I saw all kinds of kids talking from all backgrounds, all ethnicities, but my behavior data reflected something different. So we wanted to have a real conversation about that. You know, no judgment, but let's talk about it. So if talking is disrespectful while the teacher is teaching, and I see side conversations all around the room in many classrooms, then maybe we need to do something different to connect with our students, to really set the expectation about why we're not talking. So what we really did is we started to set expectations, ground rules, what was important, and we retaught those expectations. And it did have a difference on the behavior referrals, I think, because teachers started to think differently as far as how they're connecting with kids, and we started to diminish the referrals. But I will say it's been 3 years basically since I've been at Battle Creek, and I've seen the school culture and the climate go from something that was a little problematic to when I go into that building now, because I actually supervise the building. I don't see the same building that I saw 3 years ago, but we have that committed staff, the committed leadership that really worked on school culture. But one thing that they really worked on was student voice, really talking to the students about their experience, because school is their experience. What did they want to see different? What leadership opportunities were we providing students, and how are they connecting with teachers? But I do agree that school culture is very important to starting to eliminate the achievement gap.
They want us to use this one. Does this one work? Oh, maybe I need to
Turn it on down here.
Okay.
It says low battery.
Oh, that's probably why then.
Do you want this one?
Yeah, we'll keep on that one and I'll check on these.
One other quick thing on school culture, just to emphasize a couple things that Lisa said. I remember a couple of those meetings in your leadership team in that school in St. Paul. And so a couple of the roles that are really important here, you know, as far as developing positive school culture, are the roles of the school leader, right? So in part, what Lisa's saying is the principal needs to emphasize and articulate the values that are going to drive everything in that school, right? And so one of the things that I noticed that she brought to this school was an emphasis on equity pedagogy, right? So every student is going to have a fair chance in that school. Students are not going to be treated unfairly in this school, right? They're not going to be suspended at disproportionate numbers on the basis of race. That was one of the things that she was trying to interrupt. Another thing is like the school leader as meaning maker, sense maker, okay? And helping the staff to try to get a sense of where they're trying to go as a school. Someone has to narrate the school's journey, right? And hopefully it's going to be a positive journey. And that's another principal's that's another of the principal's roles. And you really talented principals, you see them doing this. You see them articulating where the school's going. This is a school on the move, and you're all a part of it, all right? And you want it to be a place that people want to come back to. Another thing that Lisa did in the staff meetings that she didn't mention is she began to invite people to bring food to the beginning of a staff meeting. So sure, it's supposed to start at 1:30. It doesn't quite start at 1:30, so people can hang out and talk about the day, and they can have food. That's building community, too, and that's a big part of it, too.
Was there
I
a...
think in front, that was the question.
Two parts to her question.
Oh, yeah.
I apologize. Go ahead.
So the other part, I think you asked, what are we doing to provide strong schools in all communities? St. Paul has an initiative, and it's part of our strategic plan, is strong schools, strong communities. So what our superintendent did is she really stopped busing kids all around the city. And we made a strong emphasis on having quality programming in all schools so it's equitable. So we didn't have all of the strong programming on this side of town, but maybe on the side of town that may have racially predictable outcomes, we don't have any strong programming. So we have areas now. So our areas, we have international baccalaureate schools. We have schools that have an aerospace background, gifted and talented. We have magnet schools. We have managed curriculum. So our students are getting the same literacy curriculum, the same math curriculum, the same science curriculum, foreign languages in all of our schools. So really we're starting at providing those basic requirements that develop a good school in all communities. And then also we have something called Parent Academy, where we're really educating and working with our parents to be advocates for their children. So how do you have that parent-teacher conference that might be difficult? How do you really show up to an IEP meeting and say, wait a minute, can you stop with the acronyms? I'm trying to advocate for my children. Can you please explain what you mean? How to really look on our, it's called School View, basically, grade book, so you can really see if your child is handing in their homework. How can we give you the skill set to sit down and work with your child to get that homework done? We also have something called it's the home teacher project, where teachers actually go out into the community and they meet parents and they develop those relationships. They see, where the living environment the child is coming from on that parent's terms. They also have conferences where parents come in and they get educated and they use data points to look at, this is what my student's learning, this is the goal that I want to set for them now. They'll come back at another standpoint to look at, how is my child doing? They give the parents skills, or they can kind of practice those homework skills at home. So we're really trying to embrace the community, but also making sure that we have quality programming all around the city.
Thank you.
All right, so my question is, so I feel that especially for a lot of white people, we kind of attribute the achievement gap to individual choices and lack of motivation on the student's part and lack of parental involvement in their child's education. So how do we kind of deconstruct this notion of a cultural deficit in communities of color into more a systemic and institutional understanding of the achievement gap?
So I think the first step, like Michael said earlier, is understanding that academic achievement is not an individual act. The achievements of individual students rest on the shoulders of many, many, many other people. They rest on the shoulders of a community ideology of success, right? And all kinds of, if you want to get technical, all kinds of social capital, cultural capital that are available to that student that are not equitably distributed in our society, all right? So I think that's extremely important, okay, to understand that achievement is not an individual act, but all kinds of things make it look that way, right? So that's why one of the things that we're advocating for is strengthening families, right? Helping families to have the resources to effectively support their children's education, right? Part of this is these are public policy issues too, right? We need more affordable daycare, right? We need things like policies that ensure that young people grow up in stable, secure homes and neighborhoods, all right? And we need early childhood policies as well that promote cognitive and social development. More PK opportunities in this state would help a lot. So I think the most important step is understanding that it's not an individual act, that so much of achievement depends on the whole social surround of young people.
I think one thing I'd like to add is really as individual question why we feel someone has a lack of motivation, because what's really behind that, what does that mean? One thing that I've worked with my teachers on, and I'll just say from a principal perspective, is do the students really understand what the directions were? So when I was at Battle Creek, we worked on just a few techniques that my staff got together. So I have a big emphasis on professional development. So I looked at my data to find out, in my opinion, what some of the issues were, and we really tackled those. So one of the ones was really delivering the content where students can understand it, because when I'd walk into a classroom, I may have had educators who would have gone through the lesson, but I'd have groups of students that were talking, and it might look like they were off task, being disrespectful, but they were actually trying to figure out, what did the teacher want me to do? Because the instructions weren't clear. So how are we breaking that information down into small segments? We really talked about knowing your students, so that's why it's important to have those common formative assessments. How are they learning along the way? Actually having a conversation with the child. What's going on? How can I help you connect with this curriculum? How can I break it down? And also understanding that that student had teachers before you. So really, what happened before then? Did they get all of the foundational principles that they needed? The parent involvement piece, parent involvement can look different in a lot of different ways. So parent involvement could be making sure that my child is getting to school every day, that they have their homework done, that I'm talking to them, making sure that they're going to be respectful, that they listen, that they respect themselves, respect others. Parent involvement could be emailing the teacher, how is my student doing? Maybe going on an electronic grade book. It could be volunteering. I think that we can't have a one-size-fits-all mentality. And also, we want to make sure that if parents aren't involved, why? Let's start to ask the questions, what can we do to make our school more inviting for you to come? Why are we having these meetings and no one shows up? I mean, there's a lot of data behind that.
Do we have another question? Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm from the university libraries and also the father of a mixed-race daughter who left the St. Paul Central High School because of, she was just totally demotivated and demoralized. And I think it gets to two structural issues here. One is the classroom-sized issue. She felt like her classes were mainly about teachers simply trying to keep control of the room. The other is the issue of assessment and the overuse of standardized tests. And that, again, she felt like she had to stop learning and growing in order to be trained how to take the next standardized test. And that this was just something she was not willing to put up with. And how do we get around these issues? I mean, can't we find more constructive, useful ways of assessment? Is there any way to get classroom sizes down? What do we do?
Thank you.
That question's for me. I will tell you, in St. Paul Public Schools, we have a class size agreement now that's built into our teacher contract. So we have certain parameters that we can't go over. So that's one thing that's starting to address the class size. And I do agree with Peter, class size is huge. It's hard to get to everybody having large class sizes. So we have a certain class size at the elementary level, and the secondary level. So I think as a district, we're committed to working toward that. And I will say the assessment piece, that's a national conversation. I think that we have these standardized assessments across the country that really start to dictate how we teach. But I will say that St. Paul has been committed to reducing the amount of time that teachers are putting on testing, and we're working at finding ways that we can reduce it even more, but we have state requirements that we're mandated to adhere to. So that's a conversation that's happening at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level.
And I appreciate the question. And to be very honest about this, a couple things. So with the class size issue, I've heard some teachers in St. Paul say one of the things they worry about the most in their classes are students who are not necessarily vocal, they are not necessarily disrupting, but what they're doing is they are waiting. They're waiting, right? And they're having to wait, right? While teachers attend to other students' needs. So that's partly a size issue. There are other policy issues here that we don't necessarily need to get into here. With regard to assessment, just as Lisa said, yes, this is a discussion that's happening at all levels right now, and there is a promising direction out of Washington, right? Okay, so with the reauthorization, standardized testing is going to be de-emphasized, and the states are going to have more control over this, right? But one of the bigger issue here is that one of the problems with standardized testing is that they tend not to measure as well what students actually learn in school, right? They tend to privilege more background knowledge, things like that. And again, not all students have the same background knowledge that maps onto the test measures, right? So that's more work that we need to do. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and I guess one other part of that is, part of what standardized testing tests is how good you are at taking standardized tests, not your knowledge or understanding.
Thank you.
And then just one additional thing, are some of those tests biased? So are they really measuring the capabilities of all students at the same rate and same level?
You spoke to the the racial solitude
Isolation.
isolation, right? And I was just wondering if you guys had any ideas about how we could address that, because in a class that I took here last semester, we talked about how we looked at studies and we looked at articles that referenced studies that said that once schools got to a certain number, about 30% of non-white students, that school would experience white flight. And I was wondering if you guys had any ideas about how to address that issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we could be getting some movement on this issue shortly, right? Because there's a pending lawsuit on racially isolated education in the state of Minnesota that's attempting to address that head on. So, a couple things when you talk about, and this goes back to I think one of Dr. Go's earlier questions to us, your question on racially isolated schools, racially isolated neighborhoods, right? I think one question everyone needs to ask themselves, if they are invested in this public project, I mean most broadly, if you care about the public, all right, in our daily lives, is to ask yourself, what communities do you belong to, right? And who else can be a member of that community, right? Because there are questions regarding housing policy, about where low-income housing is located in communities around the metro that bear on your question, right? That have a lot to do with equity and equitable opportunity for all people. So that's one thing that we can think about as well, I think. Public policy issues.
I think another thing to consider is just the importance of having strong quality schools in all communities, because as a parent myself, I want my child to go to a school that has good results, a safe climate and culture for my child, where teachers care about my child. Those are some indicators that I'm going to look for. But I think to hopefully reduce the racial isolation is that all of our schools have good programming, that we have strong teachers. I would say in environments where we have a low achievement gap? Do we have more experienced teachers? Because typically we have our novice, brand new teachers in those environments, and they just don't have the experience yet to work with our students that have different challenges and different needs. So that's something that's important. I think also really having that conversation with the school community. Are we in this together? So I'll give you an example of what, I won't name the school that I'm talking about, but one of my schools had some challenges last year. They were in the newspaper. The school wasn't together yet. And we admitted that, we talked about it, but we had a commitment to really look at what the needs of the school were and to start to address those. But one thing that I really admired about that school community, parents from all ethnicities said, this is my community school. We want this to work. So they were committed to staying there, to supporting the principal, supporting her mission, supporting her vision, but even coming in to volunteer, to help, to get on a planning committee. What can we do different? How can we make this a good school climate? How can our PTA really look at embracing everybody and providing opportunities? How do we, as a school community, reach out to all different groups of parents, not just a certain type of group of parents that show up? So just having that commitment, but the racial isolation is an issue, and I agree with Peter. We have to look at what the resources are in those communities and how we're supporting those communities, supporting our students, and supporting our families.
We're down to our last 3 minutes, and I know we have one question at the back. Before we get to that question, it's become apparent that public policy and legislature and our impact in influencing decisions that are made matter. Can either of you speak briefly about efforts in that regard to that impact a more positive educational opportunity environment, impacting policy?
I'll kind of speak to two that come to mind. One is pre-K. Having universal pre-K for all, so starting early. So there's more access to start the children off at 4 years old. And then also the other one is, and I forget the term, but our teachers that are coming from out of state, it is very challenging for them to get licensed in Minnesota. And sometimes it becomes a barrier when we have a teacher shortage. So I know at the state level, they're working to redo those policies to make sure that it's more equitable for our people coming in from different states. So those are two that I think would have a positive impact on public education.
Is class size one that can be addressed at legislature, or is that with unions?
Well, I will tell you that I think if you address class size at the legislature, there's a lot of dollars that come with it. So in St. Paul, we do have a commitment to class size, but it's expensive. Mm-hmm. So, and once we fund that, we have one bucket of resources, then that might take away from something else that's important.
Okay, thank you. Yes, final question at the back.
Hi, I worked with Minneapolis Public Schools for about 1.5 years, and I spoke with a lot of teachers and associate educators. And I noticed, at least with their district, there was a lot of opportunities for like diversity training, basically of all sorts of categories. And I went to a few of them, and some of them are helpful, some of them, like not so much. But I did notice teachers were there too. But it still seems like there was a disconnect with the teachers and their students. Like I'd go into their classrooms knowing they went to these trainings. And sometimes I would witness them trying to apply the things they learned. And it, just like wouldn't work for whatever reason. But to me, it feels like there's a disconnect with that. Like, why are there so many diversity seminars, trainings, etc., and we're not seeing that reflected in the classrooms as successfully as they would hope?
Thank you.
So one thing I'll say about that is I think that there is a lot of value in the trainings, and the trainings vary. They do. But so some of the ones that I'm familiar with, and I've gone through some of the Courageous Conversations training, I've been a part of some of that. And I think there's value in that, raising self-awareness and raising racial self-awareness, that part of it. But where some of these trainings don't go yet is just what you're saying. What does that mean for the classroom, right? And I think what we're saying is the disconnect there, what needs to be filled in, and perhaps all of you here are going to be able to contribute this, or many of you will, is that we think the key thing here is enhancing the skill set of teachers to establish teaching and learning relationships with all their students, right? It's in the relationship building and developing part of teaching that I think this is a strong theme in today's session with all of you. That's what we need to develop further, and race is going to be a part of that.
Thank you. We are at time. First of all, let's show our appreciation for the panel. And I want to thank all of you also for your great questions and your engagement. I want to make a quick plug for a topic that we can have a whole another 90-minute conversation about. But February 6th from 9:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. at the Minneapolis Community Technical College, we have a summit that addresses a topic that I think it was implied in today's conversation, increasing teacher diversity in Minnesota. Increasing teacher diversity, and our host, Professor Vichette, is here. And I encourage as many of us who can attend to address that, because that is an issue that I think is also part of the bigger hope and dream that we have for this future. It's not lost on me, a few days removed from our dear Martin Luther King's birthday, that this great man had a dream, and had a dream that his children, our children, the future, our generations, would not be judged by their skin color. And I feel like our conversation today suggests that we're making small steps, good steps, positive steps, but there's still a long way to go. And I bet each of you in the room, the teacher, as an educator, as a leader, as a parent, as a professional, cares about this deeply and can play some role in impacting this narrative, the school narrative that we're trying to change in Minnesota. So thank you for coming. It leaves me to thank our panel again, and I wish you a good rest of the day and weekend. Thank you.